Hey everyone, it's patch 3.23 Affliction, and today I want to bring you guys a guide on Arakaali's Fang. This is going to be my league starter for the upcoming league, and it is absolutely one of my favorite minion builds that I've played quite a lot of in the past. Arakaali's Fang is a wonderfully scaling build that starts off doing a very large amount of damage, and it scales into an absolute chad as you get further and further into endgame. This build can give you really great clear as you have Profane Bloom, which works with your minions, allowing you to have consistent screen-wide explosions, and it allows you to scale your single target damage really high, especially if you go the Squire route of this build, which is going to allow you to very easily dot cap on bosses, making everything die really quickly. The other nice thing about this is the minions themselves are extremely fast, and we're going to be stacking quite a lot of minion movement speed, giving them the ability to move around maps really quickly, making this not even really feel like a minion build and more so feel like a RF build where you're just consistently running forward and everything around you is just dying. What I really like about Arakaali is that it's quite easy to start off, especially now that a new div card has been added for Arakaali, which drastically reduces the week 1 prices of the weapon itself, and it makes this a build that is actually worth considering as a league starter for most people due to the massive price drop. Before we do go any further, I do want to state that disclaimer that you will need around 100 to 150 chaos to actually be able to start this build. The item itself is going to be a little bit pricey, but it's going to very quickly drop off as we move further into week 1. So if you cannot afford it on day 1, it should be fairly easy to afford on day 2 or day 3. And if you want a pretty easy way of being able to afford it on Leaguestart, I will link a guide in the description below on how to do day 1 heist, which should get you anywhere between 100 to 200 chaos depending on your luck, and it'll go a massive way to affording Arakaali's. Outside of that, the rest of this build guide will be very cheap to put together, and it's designed to be a tier 16 Guardian farmer on around a 1 to 2 div budget. Later on this season, I will have a follow-up mid-game guide that is going to talk about a 30, 40, 50 div setup for Arakaali, and you should expect that within a few days of the season launching. Until then, this guide should be able to hold your hand all the way from level 1 all the way until tier 16 in red maps and even beyond that fairly easily. Before we go any further, I do want to mention the notes section of this guide. The notes section are going to have a lot of information in them, and I highly implore you to take a look through them. This should answer basically most of your questions that you have about the build. If there's anything that this does not cover, feel free to leave a comment description. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions for you. So why don't we start by talking about how you're going to be leveling this? Well, since we're not going to be able to play Arakaali from the start, we're going to instead be opting to play a different minion skill, and we're going to be playing Absolution all the way from level 12 until red maps or until you are able to afford your Arakaali. Absolution should have no problem getting you through leveling, and it's a very comfortable skill to play. One thing to mention is we cannot immediately play Absolution. We are going to have to play Rolling Magma with Firewall until we get to level 12. This is a very overpowered skill for Witch, and should have no problem dealing with Act 1 with ease. The way Rolling Magma is going to work is you are going to want to put down a flame wall on top of you, and then you're going to want to cast Rolling Magma towards enemies. You do not want to hover your cursor directly on top of the enemy. You want to put your cursor slightly in front of them, which is going to make your bounces of Rolling Magma slightly smaller, meaning your Rolling Magma can hit the same target multiple times. You really need to make sure it goes through a flame wall, as the flame wall will effectively double the damage of it, making it really easy to 2 or 3 shot everything all the way through Act 1. But as soon as you get to level 12, you'll be able to swap over to Absolution, and this should carry you with no problems all the way through the rest of your leveling experience. As for the tree, it's going to be very simple to start with. We just want to pick up all the spell damage nodes. Not only are these going to affect Rolling Magma, but they're also going to affect Absolution, since Absolution not only is a minion skill, but also gives you a cast as well, which does a very significant portion of your damage early on. We're going to end Act 1 by picking up Enduring Bond, which is going to give you quite a lot of extra minion damage, as well as making your Absolution monsters last longer, which means it should feel a little bit better to play. Moving on to Act 2, we just want to go and pick up all the good nodes by the Witch Start. So we're going to be picking up Lore of the Dead, Lightning Walker, and we're going to path over to the Templar section of the tree, pick up Spiritual Command and Retribution. These should all be pretty big power spikes in terms of your damage, and they should make Act 2 a breeze. For Act 3, we are going to then pick up some masteries. We're going to pick up Quick Recovery and the Life Mastery just to be a little bit tankier, as well as picking up Heart and Soul to have even more life. You are going to have a little bit of a mana problem with this build, but Heart and Soul giving you a lot more mana and Quick Recovery giving you some mana regen should take care of most of it until we can move on to Eldritch Battery later on. Then we're going to also pick up Holy Dominion because Act 3 and Act 4 have quite a lot of elemental damage, and this gives you a little bit of resistance to make it a little bit easier, while also giving you some LE damage is going to scale your personal Absolution a little bit more. Moving on for Act 4, we just want to make our way over to Spiritual Aid. This is going to massively increase your personal cast of Absolution while also just being a general area of the tree that has a large amount of minion damage. This is going to give you a massive spike in damage, and it's going to make it so Act 4, Act 5, and Act 6 are very comfortable. We can't pick it up in Act 4, so it is going to take us until the start of Act 5 to get enough passive points. And after we get all the notables over at Spiritual Aid, we're going to start making our way over to Eldritch Battery. The reason we want to do this is because we are going to want to swap our auras. In Act 3, we're going to be running Clarity, Herald of Purity, and Purity of Elements, but Herald of Purity is going to start falling off, and Clarity is not going to be required as soon as we get Eldritch Battery. And because of that, we are going to swap over to Purity of Elements, Determination, and Vitality. Now, fitting all three of these together is going to be a problem because they're going to hit 0 mana, and Absolution actually costs quite a decent amount of mana to cast, and it's very mana intensive. Because of that, we need Eldritch Battery. And once you do pick up Eldritch Battery, do make sure you actually have some energy shield, which means you should look for an energy shield base, at least as your chest plate, and maybe potentially look for a second one on your helmet or your gloves or your boots. As long as you have a few hundred energy shield, you should have no problems with having mana or energy shield for the rest of your leveling experience. After you pick up Eldritch Battery, the rest of our points is simply just going to go into picking up points around the tree that are just overall very good. We're going to be picking up Ravenous Horde, which gives our minions Onslaught, as well as a lot of cast speed on the small nodes before it. We're going to pick up Mystic Bulwark with the 10% reduced mana cost of skills, which is going to make it so you don't have any sort of energy shield problems, and it's not going to hard tie you into running energy shield bases the whole time. As well as coming down to the Templar section of the tree and get ourselves Grave Pact for a very large DPS increase, and finishing off the leveling experience with Tireless. This is going to put our tree in a very good position to allow us to pick up the rest of the points that we're going to be interested in once we do get to Endgame. Where we're going to be looking for to pick up post Endgame and into maps as you are getting ready to afford to buy your Arakaali's Fang, it's just simply picking up all the block nodes. We're going to be getting ourselves Glancing Blows as well as Sanctuary and Safeguard. These two nodes have a lot of all res on them, which is going to make res capping an absolute joke. And we're going to be finishing off our spell block capping by picking up Arcane Guarding. This should give you 75/75 or very close to it. It's going to depend on the kind of shield that you find, and you are going to need a chance to block roll on whatever shield you have to actually hit attack block. The mastery on Safeguard is going to give you an insane amount of effective recovery, and it's going to keep you very safe outside of one-shots, which shouldn't really be too much of a problem considering how much armor we're going to be having and how big of a total life pool we're going to have. Moving on, let's talk about Ascendancy. So we're going to be playing this as a cultist because a cultist is going to be the best Ascendancy for our Arakaali. The way I want to talk about Ascendancy is going to be in two parts. First, we're going to talk about where you're going to take for Absolution, and second, we're going to talk about where you're going to chains once you swap over to our Arakaali. So for Absolution, realistically, all you're going to need is Vile Bastion. This is the only Ascendancy point that actually does anything for us, as the other points are either for cold or chaos-based builds. And in Profane Bloom's and Unholy Authority's case, we don't really have any tools to make use of it. Now, as soon as you hit Endgame, the first thing you want to do is buy a Mark of Submission to actually make use of Profane Bloom and Unholy Authority. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put one of your curses, either Conductivity or Elemental Weakness, into your ring, which is going to make it so you curse on hit, which means you can use Profane Bloom for clearing. And then you're also going to be able to use a second curse with Unholy Authority, which is going to go in your Arcanist brand, which means you're going to get substantially more single target damage once you get to a boss. As for your fourth point, it doesn't really matter as it's not going to be useful, so we're just going to be picking up Void Beacon just to have it for once we're ready to swap to our Arakaali. Once you are ready to swap, all you have to do is simply just unspec out of Vile Bastion and pick up Withering Presence. This node isn't that good for a build as our minions are already going to wither, so realistically this is just for 60% chaos resistance and some reduction to damage over time taken from anything that is hindered. One option, if you really want to, is you can keep Vile Bastion instead of Withering Presence, which would make you immune to stuns, which is going to feel really good. And that means you can drop your Soul of the Brine King for either Lunaris or Solaris, but that's completely up to you. I think most people are going to prefer Withering Presence, especially since it's going to help you get to Chaos Risk Cap substantially easier. As for bandits, we're simply just going to be killing all bandits as we want the 2 passive points. There's nothing else useful, and we don't really care about helping any of them. As for the Pantheons, we're going to be wanting to run Brine King to start with, as this is going to allow us to not deal with stuns as much, especially since we're going to be a block-based build. And for the Minor God, you're going to be taking Gurkthul for mapping, and you're going to be taking Ryslatha for bossing. You absolutely need Ryslatha as our Arakaali, and there is no way around this, as you're going to be using a Flasks to generate worms, which is going to allow you to spawn your minions during boss fights. And without this, you simply are just not going to be able to do any damage on very long boss fights. Next up, I want to talk about the gear that you're going to want to run for Absolution until you can swap over to Arakaali. The major things to point out here are going to be some important rolls that you can get on some of your items to increase your Absolution damage by quite a bit. So for example, you can look for a helmet with either +1 or +2 minion skill gems on it. You can also look for a wand with +1 minion or +1 spells on it as well. Or instead, you can look for a cheaper option, which should just be a wand with minion damage and minion cast speed on it. For your shield, you can use this slot as a way to fill in any sort of resistances in life you need. And you should look for one chance to block roll on here so you can hit attack block cap. The only other useful roll on here that you can look out for is either +1 to all minion skill gems or +1 to all lightning or +1 to all physical skill gems, which will give you additional level for your Absolution. As for your chest plates, we don't need any specific chest plate here. What I'd recommend is to not actually look for a 6-link. Do not buy a 6-link in this build. Since your number one priority is going to be to save for Arakaali immediately, and because Arakaali does not need a 6-link, you can instead opt to just simply run a 5-link. Or you can instead just simply stick with a 4-link, which should be enough to get you all the way through red maps, and instead opt to look for a chestplate with a large amount of life on it and any sort of resistances that you need. In my opinion, I feel like spending the money on a 6-link, at least this early on, is just going to be a waste of money and it's going to delay your Arakaali by more. As for gloves, we just simply want any sort of generic pair of gloves. And the important thing here is that we're going to want to get ourselves a Eldritch implicit on it for 15% chance to unnerve enemies. This is going to give you a decent boost for your Absolution minions. It should be very easy to do with just a random Eldritch currency that you get while mapping. Boots are just going to be a random generic pair of boots with resistance on it. And for our amulets, we just simply want to use this as a way to fill in any of our missing stats. You might have an issue with dexterity, so you can potentially look for a dexterity amulet. And the only useful thing on here, other than life or resistances, is either going to be +1 to all skill gems, +1 to all physical, +1 to all lightning, whatever you can get on here, but this is not mandatory by any means. It's just a nice DPS increase if you do want to splurge on it. For our rings, we're going to be using a Mark of Submission, which is just going to allow half of our Ascendancy to actually work. And it's going to give us a decent DPS increase by allowing us to apply 2 curses on bosses. And for our other ring, we're going to be just looking for any sort of generic bone ring with any resistances or life they need on it, as well as potentially looking for any minion damage or minion attack and cast speed rolls. These rings can also roll minion life, but you don't really care about that as you're summoning your Absolution minions so fast that even if they get low, will just be replaced by a new one. Your belt can be just any sort of generic belt and just try to get as much life on it just to make your time a little bit more comfortable. The nice thing about playing this build is you don't really need any sort of specific rolls. All this can just be generic yellow gear, which makes it really easy to scale into red maps as you can just pick up gear off the ground and just upgrade your way all the way up to steering X-Arcanator worlds with no problem. So next up, I want to talk about the swap over from Absolution to Arakaali's Fang. There are going to be 2 mandatory items to make this work. Everything else can simply just be your Absolution gear, and the rest of the gear in here are simply just better versions of the rare gear that you were using for Absolution. The 2 items required for this is obviously Arakaali's Fang itself, which is going to be the core of this build, and a unique flask called the Writhing Jar. What I want to talk about quickly is how you're going to actually spawn the spiders from Arakaali's Fang. So these spiders require 2 things. 1, it requires you to kill a monster, and 2, it requires a nearby corpse, as these spiders are summoned from a corpse itself. This is going to be very easy to do, and this is why the flask is required. Because we are basically going to do no damage, and we need to be able to kill a monster to start our loop at the start of every map. Writhing Jar is a very simple way for us to just immediately spawn monsters that just get 1 shot and allow us to get the whole chain going. To be able to actually get the corpses, we're going to be running a 4-link of Divine Ire, Castable Channeling, Desecrate, and Life Tap. We're going to be reserving all of our mana, so we need Life Tap to be able to make these cost life instead of mana. And the way this is going to work is you're going to be holding down Divine Ire. The Castable Channeling is going to trigger Desecrates under you. And after about a second of channeling Divine Ire, you're simply just going to be pressing your Worm Flask. The pulsating damage of Divine Ire is going to instantly kill them, and use the Desecrate corpses to spawn your spiders. Once you do this, your spiders should last about 50 seconds, and you'll have no problem just clearing your map. Some other useful items to mention here are going to be Gravebind and Ancient Skull. I would really recommend to buy Ancient Skull immediately because it's a 1 chaos item that is absolutely not useful in any other minion build except this one. What this does is it makes your minions hear the whispers. What the whispers do is it increases your minion attack speed by 50%, which is a massive damage amp for this build. The downside of using this helmet is that whatever minions hear the whispers are going to degen very quickly. But the nice thing about this build is that the Arakaali spiders are immune to all damage, meaning the downside of this helmet is non-existent. Gravebind is going to be a very nice pair of gloves to have in this build, but are absolutely not mandatory. You do not need these, but what these are going to do is it's going to make it so all of your spider kills are going to count as your kills, meaning as you run around a map, as your spiders are killing things, those kills are going to count as your kills, which means that Arakaali's Fang is going to keep proccing, meaning that once you summon your spiders once at the start of a map, they're just going to be resummoned through the rest of the map. Obviously, this is not going to work on bosses, especially those with no ads, but it's going to give you a massive amount of mapping quality of life. And it's going to be very, very handy to have. The rest of the gear here is simply just going to be better versions of your Absolution gear, as I mentioned before. One thing to keep in mind is that you are going to need to get spell block capped, and this is going to be a little bit harder to do with Arakaali than it is with Absolution. The most important thing here is going to be your chest plate. You are going to need to roll a 5% chance to block spell damage, either rolled implicit on it. This should be very easy to hit, and it's going to be required until we can swap over to Tempest Shield at a higher budget. Other than that, we're simply just going to be removing our other Mark of Submission in favor of another bone ring, as we are going to be using Blasphemy to make our curses and AoE around us permanently. One minor thing to mention about this gear is you are going to need substantially more dexterity than you did with Absolution, as we're going to be running a Vol Haste. Be mindful of that when swapping over. You can either just choose to not use Vol Haste for a while, or simply just keep in mind that you're going to need dexterity and look for any dexterity on the gear that you pick up to make sure that you have enough dexterity to fit everything. The next thing I want to talk about is how you're going to be able to fit all of your auras. When we're swapping over to Arakaali, we're going to be using two auras, Determination and Purity of Elements. On top of this, we are going to be running a Blasphemy, which is going to turn two of our curses into auras around us. They're effectively running 4 auras. This is going to be very mana intensive, and the way we're going to actually get enough mana reservation to be able to fit all this, as you can see, we're at 1 mana, is going to be very simple. The first thing you need is going to be a Redeemer amulet with a mana reservation efficiency of skills on it. This needs to be at least 7%, which is going to be a max roll tier 2 version of the amulet, as well as 3 jewels with increased mana reservation efficiency on them. In total, you are going to need exactly 16% increased mana reservation efficiency between your jewels and between your amulets. So that means you could look for a tier 1 roll on here, which means you're going to not need perfect 3% rolls on your jewels, and you can instead get 2%. This is going to be up to you in terms of which jewels and which roll you buy on the amulet, but just keep in mind that you need exactly 16%. Before you can actually do this, as getting a Redeemer amulet might be a little bit hard on day 1 or 2, what you can instead do is simply opt to just not run either Enfeeble or Despair, and then as soon as you do get enough mana reservation efficiency, you can turn the other curse on and run both curses. You can turn off Despair if you are okay with doing a little bit less damage, and you can turn off Enfeeble if you are okay with being a little bit squishier. In terms of our tree with Arakaali, it's going to look very similar to our Absolution tree with a few minor changes. The first one being that we're going to need to pick up Skittering Runes, which is going to give us enough mana reservation efficiency to be able to fit in all of our auras. The nice thing about this as well is that we're going to be able to get the Curse Mastery for reduced extra damage taken from crits, and when we combine that with Sanctuary Thought, and when we combine it with the Armor Mastery, we are going to be crit immune, which is going to give us a massive leg up in terms of being tanky. The only other major changes here is that we're not going to be pathing over to Eldritch Battery, as we don't actually need any sort of mana to be able to play our whole build, as we're going to be life tapping everything, and we'll be dropping Arcane Guarding. The nice thing about doing that is we're going to be able to pick up Divine Shield instead, which is going to give us another really nice defensive layer. Overall, your total regrets cost for swapping over from Absolution to this should be somewhere around 10 to 15 regrets, which should not be that bad, as by the time you get yourself your Arakaali's Fang, you should have 10 to 15 regret orbs. The last thing I want to talk about in here is going to be the flasks that we want to run for this. Now, we are going to be running Writhing Jar, which means we only get 4 flask slots. That's completely fine, as most of the traditional flasks don't really work in this build, as they cannot affect our minion. We're obviously going to be running a life flask, and this is going to be how you're going to be dealing with any sort of bleeding or corrupted blood on you. You aren't going to be able to fit a corrupted blood jewel in here, simply because we need the reservation efficiency jewels, and a corrupted blood reservation efficiency jewel is going to be fairly expensive. But since you are not really attacking in this build, the only time you might actually potentially hit something is if you Whirling Blades through it. Corrupting blood should never really be a problem, and the flask suffix should be more than enough to deal with any sort of bleed that you might happen to run across. Our other 3 flasks are just simply going to be a Quicksilver, a Granite, and a Jade flask. We're stacking quite a lot of armor, especially because later on in this build, we'll be swapping over to an Aegis Aurora at a higher budget level, which means we want to have a lot of armor, as well as it just being a very good defensive layer for early game. The Jade flask is just there to give you a little bit of evasion rating, which is going to feel really, really strong, as even just a little bit of evasion goes a very long way, and it'll make you feel very, very tanky overall. For the suffixes on these flasks, on our Quicksilver, which is simply going to get a movement speed suffix to go a little bit faster. On our Granite Flask, we're going to get an armor suffix, and our Jade Flask, we get an evasion suffix. You don't need to put these suffixes on these specific flasks. Just simply get a Quicksilver, Granite, and a Jade with these 3 suffixes between them. As for prefixes, I personally really like the reduced duration, increased effect rolls, but you can simply just not run these and just get yourself increased duration prefixes or just any other prefix that might work. You don't need to overthink your flasks too much. You just simply need to get the base flasks themselves, and it'll be more than fine to carry you through red maps. The last thing I want to talk about in this build are going to be potential upgrades once you have your Arakaali's Fang, once you have all the uniques that you need, and once you have some decent rare gear. I will be doing a follow-up video to this a few days after Affliction's launch that will go into great detail about every single slot, what you want, how to upgrade this build to a substantially higher div budget. But until then, just as a way for you to start thinking about which items you'll want to save up for, I put a little section down at the bottom of the notes section to go over some important uniques that you can choose to get as upgrades. The most important one here, which is what I would recommend for you to immediately rush as soon as you have your whole Arakaali set put together, is going to be Aegis Aurora. This is going to be plug and play directly into our build, as I've tried to do everything I can to set you up to be ready to use Aegis. You are going to be at block cap already, and you're going to have a large amount of armor, so Aegis should immediately just work and give you an insane amount of extra defenses. This is going to be your best in slot shield until a substantially higher budget where we could potentially think about swapping over to Squire, and you should save a few div depending on how much it is at the start of the season, and buy this as soon as you can, as it will basically allow you to face tank everything that isn't just a direct one-shot. Some other interesting items to think about would be Impressions, which should allow you to fit in additional auras, a Darkness Enthralled, which will give you a massive DPS boost and will be required for later higher budgets, a Brass Dome, which would allow you to drop all the crit immunity nodes on the tree, which gives you more passive points, as well as giving you a large amount of armor for Aegis Aurora, and lastly, a Paris Stampede once you have enough money to be able to afford good annoyance, and this would also allow you to drop your Quicksilver for another useful flask. That's all I really have to say about Arakaali. I hope this video answered basically all the questions that you might have about swapping over to Arakaali and playing this build on Leaguestart. Again, the notes section is very in-depth, so if you have any questions, I do implore you to look over the notes and see if the notes can answer your questions first, but if not, feel free to leave a comment in the description below. I'll be more than happy to answer for you. I'm super excited about playing this build, especially in the upcoming season, as I feel like this build will do really well in Ultimatum due to how tanky it is, as well as it just being a really fun build to map with and a really fun build to do some bossing with. If you're someone who wants to farm, for example, Uber bosses or Maven on League launch, this is a build that can do that relatively early on, and it's most likely going to be my plan, as I plan to most likely do feared rotations within the first few days of the season, and this build should have absolutely no problems with that. If you do end up playing this build yourself, I hope you have fun with it. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it's a wonderful time. And if you want to watch me play this build yourself, I will be streaming this on Twitch on League launch, and if you want to just come out and hang out, I'll be more than happy to see you there. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you cuties in the next guide.